More than 6 decades have passed since that iconic Women's March to the Union buildings, yet women are still underrepresented in various sectors of our society. National symbols that identify what we stand for as a nation are, just one example. The country's coat of arms on our IDs and birth certificates is an emblem that plays a critical role in building pride and a sense of belonging. Or does it really? Newzroom Afrika has written to the President to ask that we change the emblem in order to include one man and one woman. Here's businesswoman Dr. Judy Dlamini adding her voice to the campaign as she speaks about how women have been excluded from the nation's psyche and body politic.
My name is Judy Dlamini. I'm a concerned South African citizen. I'm concerned that we keep on celebrating August as the month of women, where we recognize the contribution made by those 20,000 women in 1956. But everything else is not saying that. We are being killed. We are not safe, no matter where we are. We are being abused. Our contribution is not being appreciated. I believe instead of celebrating in August 2020, we need to ask ourselves what went so wrong? Why are we not seen nor heard, except just be killed? Why is our contribution not celebrated or at least recognized? If you look at just the streets, the naming of the streets, the naming of important sites, the airports, it's like women never did anything. It's like women don't exist. And if we are to change the status quo, starting with just celebrating our contribution, because women have contributed over centuries, not just in this country, but in the world and the continent. We therefore request that we become represented, starting with the coat of arms. Let there be a woman and a man next to each other, representing one of our important symbols, the coat of arms. Thank you.
Important message there from Dr. Judy Dlamini. To speak to us now more about the importance of symbols in the representation of women, let's bring in diversity expert Asanda Ngoasheng, as well as Dr. Nthabiseng Moleko, who's the Deputy Chair of the Commission for Gender Equality. To the both of you, thanks very much for making time for us and welcome to the program. Asanda, let me start with you. What's interesting to note is that the coat of arms has in fact changed before in our history, several times in fact, and hopefully that gives credence for it to be able to change again. The question becomes, why is it important that it changes at this moment?
Well, I think it's a question that always gets asked about change. Why now? Why not last year or last week? It really is just about the fact that we in an era when women need to be recognized, when in an era where when we know better, right, we do better. And so it's about the fact that in this country and globally, whenever we want to represent a human form, we choose a male figure to do that. And that's a problem because it erases women. It erases women's work, as has already been said. And the time really is now for us to change that and to show, the country and to show the women that we recognize their efforts and we recognize their, importance in the society. Because you must remember, South Africa is majority women and not men, as people, like to think.
Dr. Nthabiseng, let me bring you into the conversation. So symbols, one would hope, will be the first start of a chain reaction to getting real material change. I'm interested, as we have this conversation, how do we ensure that we maintain that focus, that, this really is just the start of hopefully a whole lot more still to come?
Thank you so much for having me, and good morning to all your listeners. I think let's first look at what is the coat of arms. The coat of arms is really a symbol of national unity, and it's essential that we look at how it's a symbolic gesture symbolizing unity of the country, but also looking at different aspects of the coat of arms. You see how it represents humanity. It looks at rebirth. It looks at knowledge and the willpower of South Africans. So it's to combine all those elements using the different symbolism in the coat of arms. I think what's important about unity in this time is that we're facing a scourge of gender-based violence. We're facing the scourge of entrenched patriarchy. We're facing the scourge of economic exclusion, and I term it economic violence against women. And I think it would be a good gesture in our symbolic elements to also include protection and to also have gender diversity in it by including women as a symbol of rebirth, of wholeness, of hope. Remember, women carry in them the potential to give life, carry in them nurturing, carry in them the next generation. So I think in South Africa, we need that hope, we need that resuscitation, we need that restoration, and women really represent that. By bearing them in the coat of arms, we would probably begin to see that as well coming forth. Symbolically, of course, this is a symbolic gesture. Yeah. And I think that we must understand it as such. It doesn't negate the legislative, doesn't negate the governmental arm and all the other aspects that need to be taken into cognizance.
Doctor, you speak about, this being a symbolic gesture. Asanda, let me ask you this. Critics have already started pushing back, mentioning that, we see symbols in all aspects of our lives. I mean, there are symbols to restaurants, symbols telling you where the emergency exit is, symbols directing you to the escalators. The point being made is that symbols aren't gendered. What's your response to that?
Well, I mean, of course, people are going to think that symbols are not gendered because if you remember, not long ago, nobody saw the need to actually make sure that the person on the bathroom is actually a person and not a representation of a man. There's a history to that, There's a history wherein the male body is seen to represent humanity in the same way that if you look at race, there's a history of, representing white people or whiteness as the sort of norm. And so the same thing happens with gender, where men are assumed to represent any and all. And it's only recently that people have come to think of the need to even think about making sure that the symbols that we have represent, women rather than representing the person or an androgynous type of person more in the masculine form. So it's about conscientizing society, and it's about getting society to understand that, the symbolic is important and that men do not represent a person or personhood. And that's something that's not always easy to explain to people, but I urge those who are critical and those who are not sure to think about how, for the longest time post-94, Black people had to argue quite vociferously that we needed street names to be changed and that we needed various symbols of humanity, to represent Black people and to understand Black people. So this is similar to that. And even in that era, if you remember, of the name changes, people were saying, no, it's going to cost too much money. No, it doesn't make sense, etc., etc. But the point of the matter is we are a majority female nation, and it really makes no sense to me that we continue to live in a country that continues to not recognize women and continues to not think about the ways in which women are represented in society and in the symbolic, because we know the symbolic is important. The entire Rhodes Must Fall movement, for example, was based on the falling of a statue, which was a symbolic gesture of dismantling a system. And so this is a symbolic gesture and should be recognized as a symbolic gesture. And people need to educate themselves and help themselves to understand why this is important, because we live in a patriarchal society, it's easy to think it's just a basic thing and people are just, exaggerating something that isn't that important, but this is important.
It's interesting you mentioned the Rhodes Must Fall movement, Asanda. Dr. Moleko, activist spaces have in some respects actually developed quite a complex understanding of gender, which has moved past the binary. Have we gotten ourselves into a corner here by the language that we're using to make these very valid points? Because, as I'm sure you'd know, there are many instances and spaces where people no longer speak about man and woman, but speak about a gender spectrum.
I think that taking it back to your linking it to the coat of arms and the question of symbolism, and I think the backlash that comes from the from the change of a coat of arms, the South African public would ask themselves in a moment of reflection, what are the importance of these symbols? Do we need, I think in a symbol, if you look at the symbol right now, you wouldn't necessarily see a specific necessarily gender. It's a symbol of a human or a person in the symbol. But I think we need to really move, in this time that we're in, we need to measure the time and really reflect on where we are as a society. I think that it's important to look at symbolism, which is key in this regard. But I also think that we need to take the discussion to issues around our participation in the economy, towards our economic emancipation, take it to the issue of our existence and our realization of those women that marched in 1956 to go against carrying a pass in terms of decision-making at all level of government, at all level of public participation, and looking at our attainment of our goals around education, women in the economy, women in manufacturing, women in STEM, and also looking critically at the systemic violence against women and children and marginalized communities. I think we haven't successfully eradicated all of these social and economic inequalities. And I think that unfair discrimination still is very much entrenched in our society. And I think the focus, I would say, as Commissioner of Gender Equality is the enactment of our acts and our bills and our laws. I think a lot of the time we can get sidetracked and we're not focusing on the key things. I think the country is now facing an economic and a GBV crisis. And I think our discussion really needs to go to looking at what tools and how effective are our policy tools and mechanisms to quelling these issues. And I think our discussion must look at that. We must reflect as a country. We do need to make sure that we have adequate corrective action in this regard. We've got a lot of acts. We've got a lot of bills as a country. Absolutely. The question is, how successful have we been in quelling socioeconomic inequality, the gender wage gap? How successful have we been in making sure that our communities are safe, making sure that women and children and marginalized groups are able, irrespective of sexual orientation, to be free and actually be safe in our communities. And we haven't seen that in South Africa. And I think that's really where the discussion needs to also point to. And I think we definitely need to have, I would say, a national consensus or national boss board or national coordinating council of GBV, which we have in the cards, and also looking at the economy, because on the main, the unequal access and the inequalities are worsened for women, particularly because those bridges and those systemic failures exist and they continue to exist in our economy. So I think let's take the discussion to that. Let's take to the discussion to those furthering those objectives, because we need to restore our economy and we need to restore our communities, because we really are finding that we are a broken nation in many regards. And I think people need hope in this time. And I'm wanting to say that we can restore and see South Africa fulfilling a destiny, but we need to have the right discussions so that we can actually fix the things that need to be fixed.
And this conversation can really go on for much longer. I'm out of time, but Asanda, very quickly, there's a call for a national call to action. Do you feel, though, that that project is still largely male-dominated? I couldn't help but notice that of the three big parties in the country yesterday, the main messages still came from men.
Yeah, I think for me what's fascinating about South Africa is that, as Dr. Nthabiseng has already said, we have this obsession with, making sure that we have acts, making sure that we have policies, and we have great policies in the same way that we have a great constitution. But until and unless that constitution is lived by all South Africans or all people in South Africa, we're in trouble. Until and unless all those policies and all those acts are implemented and lived by all in South Africa, we can have 100 calls to action. We can have 100 campaigns. What we need now is no longer to focus on policy, really. What we need now is just to make sure that in all of our thinking and that in all of our doing, we are considering women and we are making sure that women are prioritized.
Right. Thank you very much to the both of you. Really, really appreciate your insights. Dr. Nthabiseng Moleko is the Deputy Chair of the Commission for Gender Equality, and Asanda Ngoasheng is a diversity expert. To the both of you, once again, thanks very much indeed. And that conversation, of course, on the back of our launching the hashtag Change for Her campaign in an effort to push for real, tangible change to address the plight of women in South Africa.